For many years, China has increased its economic and military power while keeping a low profile. And now, the time has come when China shows its will and its might. This results in a harsher policy, greater assertiveness, and a growing military presence. On both sides of the Pacific, the perception of a rising China and a declining America is widespread. In the United States, China is seen as a power interested in subverting the international order to erode US influence and power. From the Chinese point of view, America tries instead to hinder the natural rise of China, to avoid any alternative to an American-centric world. To understand today's reality and its possible evolutions, it is necessary to explain the strategic and geopolitical motivations of the two superpowers, keeping in mind that economic interests often reinforce geostrategic imperatives and ideological predilections. The United States, heirs of the British Empire, being the dominant power of the American continent and being dependent on international trade, need to protect not only their own coasts, but trade routes. Moreover, as the British Empire has done for centuries, they have as their strategic imperative to prevent a single power from dominating another region of the globe. Exactly what is happening with China. If you think that 80–85% of global trade is transported by sea, it is easy to understand why the US Navy is the most powerful in the world. China, however, still up until a decade ago, was primarily a continental power with armed forces focused heavily on a large army and an aviation and a navy with defensive purposes. However, the incredible economic growth and the ambitious project of the One Belt, One Road initiative are a symptom of a radical change. China today imports many more raw materials than it produces, and years of massive investments in industrial production have generated an overproduction. It therefore seems inevitable that in order to protect the vulnerable supply routes and to defend itself against the diplomatic encirclement of the United States, China will acquire a powerful navy. The reason for the inevitable contrast between the two powers derives precisely from having these similar strategic needs. China has set herself off on a collision course with the US strategic imperative, the global dominance of the seas, and at the same time, this very US strategic need is perceived as a threat against Chinese maritime trade. The development of the Chinese Navy, its progress in anti-ship missiles, the aggressive claim of those who consider its islands and its reefs in the South China Sea, all this is seen by the United States as an aggressive behavior by a China innocent. China in turn considers them defensive measures against the American superpower. China as one of the biggest standing army in the world, the second most important economy, and is the country that, most of all, is advancing at the fastest rate both in civilian and military-related technology. The latter just mean that, at this pace, is filling the gap it has with the US armed forces. China has a huge army, and in the event of war, as well as India, can rely on something like just under 500 million people eligible for military service. A fact that would make sure a total war against China to be a very, very bloody affair. However, China's President Xi Jinping recently announced a radical change in the structure of the army itself and its relevance. Officially started on December 31, 2015, it will be completed in 2020. The main objective is to abandon the Soviet-style army-centric command structure adopted at the time of Mao Zedong, and improve the balance between the armed forces to effectively conduct joint operations. So what will these changes consist of? First and foremost, the People Liberation Army will be reduced by 300,000 units before the end of 2018, while at the same time is set to increase the size of its Marine Corps from about 20,000 to 100,000 as overseas ambitions expand. In the old Chinese armed forces, the four general departments, staff, politics, logistics, armaments, were undoubtedly the most powerful organs employed by the Central Military Commission. The reform replaces them with 15 agencies. The reform also reduces and transforms the 7 pre-existing military regions into 5 war theaters: North, South, East, West, Central. Furthermore, 2 new military forces are to be introduced: the Rocket Force, formerly the 2nd Artillery Corps but elevated to service level, and the establishment of the Strategic Support Force that includes top experts in fields like space, cybersecurity, and electronic warfare, which underscores the importance placed upon the further development of these capabilities. It seems superfluous to say at this point that the Chinese Navy and the Air Force will no longer have a merely defensive task, but more and more advanced power projection capabilities. In our humble opinion, we think that if this reform won't be tempered by the political requirement to maintain control, and if Xi would manage to use his anti-corruption campaign wisely, the People's Liberation Army will emerge extremely strengthened and will be ready to make a further leap in quality. To this end, the figure for the defense budget amounts to $190 billion. However, it is believed China's defense budget is more consistent than the declared sum, up to $250 billion. Therefore, we can only make some hypotheses on the basis of the information we have and the research carried out. Since 1956, the year of the foundation of today's China National Space Administration, the Chinese Space Agency, the progress made by the People's Republic in space has been overwhelming at the very least. In 2013, China for the first time made the moon landing with the rover U-2, the Jade Rabbit from Chinese legends. China plans to send astronauts to Earth satellite by 2036, while the landing of a Chinese rover on Mars is scheduled for 2020. Today is the 2nd country in the world, after the US, for the number of military satellites. China might field probably the largest main battle tanks active force in the world, but half of this force is very old and may be used only as mobile artillery. The rest, from Type 88AB onward, consists of 2nd to 3rd generation tanks. The most modern being a reliable force, although not comparable to the most advanced design and very far from, say, South Korean K2 Black Panthers. About the other armored vehicles, we consider 2 of them to stand out for their interesting design. The first one is ZTD-05 Amphibious Light Tank. Compared to the US cancelled Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle program, this amphibious tank can be launched from an amphibious assault ship and, as it features an hydroplane design, can perform over-the-horizon attacks and engage targets while skimming across the surface of the water at a speed of 45 km per hour. The planned 100,000 Chinese Marine Force will have therefore a better vehicle than US AAV-7A1 amphibious assault vehicle, which entered service in 1972. The ZTL-09 is a very fast armored fire support vehicle, and it is interesting because it is equipped with a respectable 105mm gun, while capable to probably reach a speed of 90-95 km per hour. Someone has speculated that its armament is not capable to penetrate the most modern armors, but honestly, we wouldn't bet on it. For sure, with its speed, it is far than capable to outmaneuver an enemy tank and strike it at the rear side. Not enough, it is fully amphibious. We really need to speak about Chinese missiles capabilities, and we must at least speak about 3 important things. China is the 2nd country after the US with exo-atmospheric interception capabilities, land-based mid-course phase anti-ballistic missile interception technology, and with proved anti-satellite capabilities, but otherwise has still somewhat limited anti-ballistic capabilities. JL-2 submarine-launched ballistic missile variant of the DF-31 intercontinental ballistic missile is the first Chinese ballistic missile to allow Chinese submarines to strike portion of the US from Chinese coasts. This guarantees China to be able to resist a first nuclear attack and be able to retaliate. Third, and probably the most important of all, Dongfeng 21D and Dongfeng 26 are the first anti-ship ballistic missiles. Having been dubbed the carrier killers, they are considered by some analysts to be able to neutralize an aircraft carrier even without carrying nuclear munition. The emergence of this family of missiles has reportedly caused major changes in US strategy and has divided the US analysts into two groups. On the one hand, there are those who think that now the big American aircraft carriers have become big and expensive floating targets. On the other hand, there are those who think that these missiles are not game changers, because in order to hit mobile targets over such a long distance, target acquisition systems are needed, and those are vulnerable both to electronic countermeasures and to the defenses of the entire carrier group. Furthermore, to be blunt, trying to sink a 100,000 tons metal monster is definitely not a joke. We think, however, that Chinese advances in satellite technology and especially quantum technology, plus the new hypersonic vehicles technology with the imposing kinetic energy they produce, might pose a serious threat in the near future. Perhaps not able to sink such giants, but absolutely certain to be able to impose a mission kill, making the ships unable to operate for many months. Liaoning is the sole Chinese operational aircraft carrier. Bought from Ukraine, unfinished and stripped of any military equipment and propulsion, part of the Soviet Kiev-class family, it required an immense effort to transport it to China, where it went extensive refurbishment. It has been useful much more as a training ship, to allow the Navy to study its design and gain familiarity with aircraft carrier operations, assisted by Russian advisors. Thanks to this, China has acquired the necessary knowledge to start producing aircraft carriers by itself, the second which, of similar size and better capabilities, has been launched on 26 April 2017, the first domestically built. China is likely building a super aircraft carrier now, with an electromagnetic aircraft launch systems (EMALS) as the new US Gerald Ford class, with a probable displacement of more than 90,000 tons. Chinese Navy is second for total tonnage after US Navy. It is easy to get an idea of how big is this navy if you consider, for instance, that it has 59 between LPDs and LSTs amphibious vessels capable of landing a large and well-equipped expeditionary force. The Jin-class submarines is capable to carry the already mentioned JL-2 ballistic missile, although it has been said that it's too noisy and for that reason will be easily detected. It's the first Chinese submarine to be able to retaliate against a first nuclear strike, thus providing China with a serious nuclear deterrence power. It will be replaced by the Tang class. The Han class was the first Chinese nuclear-powered submarine class, and Shang class it's an improvement on the previous one, and the first to include VLS cells for land attack capability. Both are deemed to be very noisy and therefore easily detectable. This issue seems to have been solved in the upcoming new nuclear-powered attack submarine class, Type 095. The Yuan class is the first air-independent propulsion Chinese attack submarine and as such completely solved one of the most persistent issues regarding submarine design, noise reduction. China has an impressive number of destroyers, and Luoyang class, especially the latest model, Luoyang 3 or Type 052D, is one of the most advanced in the world, featuring a stealthy hull and Dragon High, the Chinese multifunctional active phased array radar system, and is the result of China's huge leap forward in shipbuilding capabilities and technologies. Not even halfway in the production series of these incredibly advanced destroyers, China has started the production of what is going to be the first Chinese cruiser, and the first has been launched on 28 June 2017. If its displacement is confirmed, it will be the heaviest and for sure one of the very best and advanced in the world. It carries the new Type 346B Chinese active phased array radar, and it is equipped with a very large modular VLS cell that in the future might launch weapons actually still in development, like hypersonic scramjet missiles, two-stage long-range surface-to-air missiles, and HQ-19 anti-satellite anti-ballistic missiles. China, despite the shift in building heavier vessels, won't stop building frigates, as they prove very useful to assert control in the contested seas of the south and east. Starting with the Jiangkai 1 class and especially the latest Jiangkai 2 class, they are deemed to be very powerful frigates, capable to provide air defense in a range of 50 kilometers, thus addressing completely the other issue affecting all of the older Chinese vessels: air defense. They have a stealthy design, and a great deal of attention was paid during the building process to use synthetic raw material like fiberglass or radar absorbent material. All of this makes them quite a dangerous encounter and perfect escort ships for Chinese future aircraft carrier strike groups. Chinese used to field a very large fleet of missile boats and submarine chaser, the only strategy possible to build a navy without having both the economic and technology requirements needed to build larger ships. As China has gone far beyond its past technology deficiencies, it is interesting that still considers very useful these boats. Indeed, they may prove to be useful, as China's island chains might offer the perfect environment to apply hit-and-run swarm tactics, or to rapidly reclaim those islands in case of a hostile amphibious invasion. Chinese Air Force is the largest in Asia. It is probably among all the branches of the PLA the one in which trying to draw a conclusion about its overall capability is the most difficult. Why? One has to consider that China in general, between the 80s and 90s, was just a country with an enormous and bad-equipped army. The Air Force is the branch which, most of all the others, will reap the benefits of the amazing technology advancements in the next few years. Think about this. China still operates reverse-engineered MiG-21 aircrafts and in large numbers, J-7, and operates copies of Sukhoi 27, Sukhoi 30 and Sukhoi 33, respectively Shenyang J-11, Shenyang J-16 and Shenyang J-15, and felt the need to buy Sukhoi 27 and Sukhoi 30 to get their hand on somewhat more reliable Russian advanced aircrafts. Then, after decades of copied designs and lesson learned, on 11th January 2011, a 5th generation Chinese aircraft appeared in the Chinese skies in its first maiden flight, the Chengdu J-20. Almost 2 years later, on 31st October 2012, a mid-sized 5th generation fighter, Shenyang J-31 prototype, made its maiden flight, thus making China the first country after the US to have 2 active 5th generation fighter aircraft projects in development at the same time. The Shenyang J-31 shows many similarities with US F-35C. For this reason, it's supposed to be an advanced carrier-based stealth 5th generation fighter. Anyway, it's the Chengdu J-20 that has raised lots of concerns among US strategists. It is a single-seat twin-engine aircraft with delta canard design and low radar observability that should be ready for starting deployment in the 2-year period 2018-2019. The J-20 is larger than the US F-22. 67 feet versus 62, with a 44-foot wingspan for both aircrafts, and for this reason it should be able to carry more fuel and weapons than the US counterpart, an important factor in the vast Asia-Pacific area. The America Raptor has the advantage of being stealthier, combining a more advanced design and greater know-how in the use of radar-absorbing materials. The stealthiness of the Chinese fighter is concentrated only in the frontal section, and it is very unlikely that the J-20 could mount a suite of sensors comparable to that of the F-22. This provides US Air Force pilots with an incomparable knowledge of the battlefield and all its evolutions. The philosophy of the Chinese project is, however, different from the US one. The F-22 Raptor was born as an aerial supremacy fighter that can be used in every operating theater of the globe. The J-20 will instead be just a piece of the vast Chinese interdiction strategy in East Asia. Being a large and heavy fighter that concentrates frontally its stealth capabilities, it is likely that the task of this aircraft will be to deeply penetrate into the enemy aerial deployment, while swarms of less performing Chinese aircrafts will engage the other enemy aircrafts. Objective of these incursions: to disrupt the enemy support infrastructure composed of highly vulnerable aircraft such as AWACS, tankers, ESR aircrafts, so as to make the weight of the conflict less and less sustainable for the US. And every military analyst knows how much US forces depend on AWACS, tankers and ESR aircraft. In addition, because of carrying less fuel than the J-20, the F-22 is more dependent on the support of the tankers than the Chinese fighters. By doing this, China could destroy enemy logistical and intelligence assets, indispensable in order to carry out precision strikes, thus depriving US forces of radar coverage and strike range. Furthermore, they could isolate enemy deep penetrating aircrafts, allowing Chinese air forces to encircle and destroy them. Moreover, its combination of advanced stealth and long-range strike capability may seriously put US naval surface forces at risk. Nonetheless, China is struggling to produce its indigenous turbofan propulsion engine. This has always been the Achilles heel of the Chinese aerospace industry, and until it will be able to fix this deficiency, Chengdu J-20 will be powered by Russian turbofan engines, the only one available. And even Russia is struggling in producing a reliable turbofan engine for very high-performing 5th-generation aircrafts. India, the same. Anyway, China is starting to become a technological power as well as military and economic. The gap with the budget allocated by the United States in research and development is still very significant, but the huge resources mobilized for this purpose are starting to bear some fruits. In some fields, for example the artificial intelligence and quantum technology, China might become a leading player in the coming years. Difficult to make hypotheses, but future discoveries applied in the military could further disrupt the balances dictated by over 70 years of Pax Americana. So, we should really ask ourselves, will this be the end of the American century?